welcome to Life Matters. I'm Colby Mazzarella. Our show's mission is to protect human life from natural conception to natural death. And we do it by bringing you guests who protect human life all the way from natural conception to natural death. Our guest today is Andrew Beckwith, Vice President of Massachusetts Family Institute. Welcome to the show, Andrew.
Thank you for having me.
So you were going to tell us about something on the end-of-life issues in Massachusetts. What's going on?
That's right. Well, we have coming up this fall on the ballot what's called the Death with Dignity Act. And this is a ballot initiative funded largely by out-of-state entities to try and set up a physicians-assisted suicide scheme in Massachusetts like they have in Washington and Oregon State.
So Washington and Oregon already have physician-assisted suicide, or it's also called doctor-prescribed suicide?
Correct.
That sounds a little odd to people who, the rest of the states, first of all, I think we should back up and say, what's a ballot initiative in Massachusetts?
Right. Well, ballot initiative is a way to enact legislation that doesn't make it through the legislative process up at Beacon Hill. So in this example, the legislation was brought forward with, I think, approximately 60 to 80,000 signatures. There's a specific requirement. And then it goes before the legislature. And if they don't act on it by a certain time, in this case it was in mid-May of this year, or if they don't approve it or fail to pass it, then it goes on the ballot.
So if they get enough signatures, it goes on the ballot, people go to the poll in November,
Right.
and there it is in front of them. What's it going to say?
Well, that's actually a good question. There's been a lawsuit filed in the Supreme Judicial Court for Suffolk County that specifically alleges that the ballot language that people will see when they step into the voting booth is misleading. And there's a particular provision in state law that allows people to bring that lawsuit. And the concern is that, first of all, the title is called Death with Dignity Act. And that in of itself is misleading, because when you hear that, most people are going to think of what's called palliative care or hospice. And palliative care is for people that are suffering with a great deal of pain, maybe from a chronic illness. Palliative care allows them to get sort of high levels of painkillers, and it's a specific way to treat high levels of long-lasting pain, to make people comfortable. And that's not what this is about.
So death with dignity sounds like you're going to kill the pain, but actually it's going to kill the patient.
Right, that's exactly right.
So the title, it was so deceptive that people sued over it.
That's right.
What happened with the lawsuit?
Well, unfortunately, it was dismissed by the judge, but the issue still remains very much alive as far as the practicality of making sure we educate people about what this bill means. And the language is, I think, deceptive. I'll just read it real briefly. This is what people will see on the ballot. They have the full language of the proposed bill, and then there's a summary, but these are multiple paragraphs long and sort of written in legalese, and unfortunately, most people probably aren't going to read the whole thing right there in the heat of the moment in the ballot box. So what they will read is what's called the ballot yes vote statement, which is a brief summary of what will happen if the person votes yes. In this case, it says a yes vote would enact the proposed law allowing a physician licensed in Massachusetts to prescribe medication at the request of a terminally ill patient meeting certain conditions to end that person's life. So the word suicide isn't in there at all, and that's clearly what this is. It's a person taking their own life with the assistance of a doctor and a poison pill, a literal poison pill.
If you take a pill to end your life, it's suicide.
Right.
But the ballot, when you vote in November, it's going to say vote for medication.
Right, and really the definition of medication is something that heals or restores, not something that ends life. So that term right there is specifically misleading.
Okay, so voters are going to have, they'll have a choice between reading long paragraphs that sound legalistic,
Right.
or a short summary that says allow medication for someone to end their life.
Right.
Death with dignity.
Right.
So,
Which again sounds like palliative care. They think medication, this is something to deal with the pain,
Right.
not to intentionally cause death.
so you could actually vote yes on that if you thought it was going to be pain medication of some kind to smooth their dying process.
That's exactly right. And that's the concern, that we think people will believe that it's that and not the suicide that it is.
What kind, can they use any kind of medication that's toxic, or?
It's up to the physicians, as far as I understand it, yeah.
Now, this is already happening in Oregon and Washington. How's it going?
Well, they've found there that majority of people who elect to commit suicide in this way often have undiagnosed depression. And so it's not just physical aspect of an illness, but they have a mental condition that causes them to despair and give up on life. And so that's one of the reasons why they're taking this option to sort of opt out of life.
So anyone might feel depressed or despairing if they're in tremendous pain or have just been given a terminal diagnosis by their doctor.
Right.
What else could you be doing instead of taking a poison pill?
Well, I mean, any number of treatments that might be available, and that raises a good point. When there was testimony up at Beacon Hill back in March, I believe, of this year on this bill, there were a number of people who came forward and testified personally about their experiences of having been diagnosed with a so-called terminal illness and given anywhere from 3 to 9 months to live. And here they are 15, 20, 25 years later testifying that that diagnosis was incorrect, that they fought for their life and they made it and have survived for decades. So that's another concern. According to the American Medical Association, over 30% of terminal diagnoses are incorrect. In other words, 1 out of every 3 approximately times the doctor says you only have 6 months to live, the individual lives much longer.
So I think a lot of us have heard of cases like that. Someone was given 6 months to live, and here they are still alive.
Right.
If they had preferred to end their life with a doctor-prescribed suicide, they wouldn't be here now.
Right.
What if it's correct? What if the diagnosis is correct? They are going to die soon. Well, first of all, what about the depression? I mean, that would be a shock to you to hear the news, and you might
Right.
be in a lot of pain. What other true treatments would there be? Actual medication or treatment for pain, for example?
Well, for pain, again, there's palliative care, which is sort of an intensive way of addressing acute pain from chronic illness. There's also something called deep palliative sedation. So for those rare examples where someone is just in constant pain and can't get over it, they can actually be placed in a medical coma. I mean, I'm not a doctor, it's just something I read about, but placed in a medically induced coma until hopefully that pain resolves. So again, they're addressing the pain specifically. They're not trying to, as in the case of this bill, affirmatively end someone's life. So there's always that hope of recovery. And that goes along with the Hippocratic Oath, right? First, do no harm. And doctors, you cannot stand by that oath and practice what this bill has in mind.
So doctors have taken an oath when they graduated medical school.
Right.
They said, at first I will do no harm. It even says I won't prescribe a deadly potion, I think in the ancient Greek term. So are they going to undo their oath in some way?
Well, that's one of the concerns of this bill, is that you're crossing a really fundamental line in the healthcare profession. And so it brings you to the proverbial slippery slope. What's next?
So I have researched a little bit about the Netherlands. In Holland,
Right.
they have had doctor-prescribed suicide for many years. And the mentality of somebody who's elderly or sick, and knowing that a doctor might be helping them get better or might be prescribing suicide, it just changes the whole doctor-patient relationship.
Sure. I think it sort of eliminates that level of trust that a doctor's looking out for your best interests in your health, and now they become potentially a counselor to your death. And that's another one of the concerns that's in this bill is real lack of safeguards. It requires 2 witnesses when someone makes the request for this poison pill. But it only requires that one of those witnesses not be someone who would inherit from that patient's estate.
So how would that work out? I want you to give me a scenario. Here's
Sure.
someone, he's been diagnosed terminally ill, going to supposedly
Right.
going to die in
Right.
6 months, and
Right. Well, I can give you an analogous scenario from my own personal experience. My wife and I went out to visit my godmother in Nevada, outside Las Vegas, several years ago. She has since deceased. And she was a retired Air Force lieutenant colonel and lived by herself. And that is the beginnings of the onset of dementia, we think. She was always kind of eccentric, so it was a little hard to tell. But had an assisted suicide bill been passed in Nevada, where she was and where we were, I was in her will, my wife was not, and had a doctor diagnosed her with an illness that that would be terminal for her. My wife and I could have convinced her to ask for the pill, because my wife could have been the non-beneficiary witness, I could have been the beneficiary witness. And we could have done that out there. She had no relatives nearby. We could have taken her to the doctor, convinced her and the doctor this was in the best interest, signed as a witness. And then, again, there's no safeguards for when the pill is actually taken. It doesn't have to be in the presence of the doctor. So they give it to the individual, and the individual takes it at their leisure. So, my wife and I could have driven her to the hospital, gotten the pill, driven her home, and then, convinced her or forced her to take it. I mean, there's just really no safeguards in this bill at all. So it's a recipe for elder abuse.
It sounds like an Alfred Hitchcock movie.
It could play out that way. It really could.
So imagine, your actual godmother, an elderly woman living on her own.
Right.
You're in her will. You wanted to hurry up and get your inheritance and not wait this supposed 6 months.
Right.
So you and your wife, who's not in the will, could be the two witnesses.
Correct.
And no necessary witnesses for taking the pill, so
Right.
you could have put it in her food or something,
Right.
God forbid.
Right.
Okay, that's a little bit disturbing. Now,
And just to follow up on
Yeah.
that, the bill does require that the death certificate, when it's signed, not mention the suicide at all. So that it's required that the record of death list only the underlying natural cause. So then there would be no record for if some other relative wanted to check in on what happened and got the death certificate. There'd be no indication that it was the result of assisted suicide.
so if this law passed, if we vote in November to have a doctor-prescribed suicide, we could have City Hall full of death records that
Right.
say they died from cancer, they died from heart disease, they died from anything,
Right.
kidney failure, they died from anything. But in fact, many of them could have died from a poison pill prescribed by a doctor,
Right. There'd be no way to tell.
and there wouldn't be a record of it.
Correct.
So somebody who felt suspicious, oh my gosh, Andrew's godmother passed away, it was so weird, it happened right when he was there. They'd look at the death certificate and say she died of whatever, heart disease or something.
Right.
That's a little strange. Now, why do you think, why did the legislators, it wasn't written by legislators,
No, it wasn't.
was it?
It was written by the so-called Death with Dignity committee.
Who's the Death with Dignity committee?
You can go online and find out who they are, but they're funded in large part by out-of-state groups. I believe George Soros is behind some of them, and so this is a national push to have this type of legislation passed in multiple states.
So people are coming in from out of state and saying Massachusetts is a good state to join Oregon and Washington,
Right.
and we'll write this bill, we'll write this proposed law which says you can have a doctor-prescribed poison pill
Right.
if you're supposedly having 6 months to live, and it won't even be on the death record. What would motivate someone to say we're not even going to record the exact cause of death?
I think they want to keep the results, the consequences of a bill like this as quiet as possible. If there's no record of it publicly, then it's going to be very hard to keep track of how many people are actually exercising this deadly option.
So if Washington and Oregon had the same kind of language in their law,
Right.
then now we have no idea how many people are ending their life with a prescription
Right.
for death.
Right.
The plot thickens.
Yes, and so you ask, how does this bill even get onto the ballot? It wasn't done through the legislative process. We can't point our fingers at any of the local legislators for crafting it in total, because it was funded by out of state. And although local voters had to sign the initiative petition, over $100,000 came in from out of state to pay paid signature gatherers to get the signatures.
Well, I've been in the mall and seen signature gatherers, and they're paid minimum wage, and they walk up to you with their clipboard, and they say, "Can you help me out signing this petition?" And it would say, "Death with dignity," right?
Right. So no one's reading the fine print at the mall. They're just signing it. So
Yeah,
it's not a homegrown initiative at all.
Yes. I want to get back to treatment of pain a little bit.
Sure.
I know that there's been enormous technological improvements over the years that people who would suffer with pain when I was a kid that couldn't be treated, now it can be treated. I know when I go to the doctor's office, I see signs everywhere. It says, your pain can be treated. We are responsible. You tell us you are in pain, and we'll work on that. So do you have any recommendations? Somebody is considering voting for this. They're saying, what if I was in pain and I just wanted to end it?
Right.
What would you recommend?
Well, again, I'm not a doctor, but the Massachusetts Medical Society has come out against this referendum. So I think they believe that there's sufficient life-preserving ways of dealing with chronic pain.
The Massachusetts Medical Society represents doctors,
Right.
and they don't want their doctor-patient relationship to include killing.
Right. I mean, that puts a real sort of onus on the doctors, a burden on physicians to have to wrestle with this issue. I think it's much safer for everyone. It's much clearer for doctors to be in the business of saving lives and preserving life rather than extinguishing it.
I know the American Medical Association, the AMA, also came out against it.
Yeah.
So it has been working in Oregon and Washington and in other countries. Do you have any other information about what's happening in those areas?
I mean, just you hear anecdotally, I think from the Netherlands, where they have vans now that will come from the hospital or from the clinic to your home and administer the poison to you there.
That's we're really going into science fiction movies here now. So they have a death van in Holland.
Right.
It'll drive to your home with the poison for you to
administer to it. Yeah, and I mean, and so then you wonder about, as we're talking about, healthcare reform and the tremendous costs of healthcare and making sure that everyone's covered. So you have that on one side, and on the other side you have potentially the ability for doctors to prescribe poison pill. I mean, clearly that poison pill is going to be a lot less expensive than probably any of the other options. And at some point, that economic pressure is going to push people in the wrong direction.
Well, I saw a letter from an Oregon insurance company. It said, sorry, we're not going to pay for the treatment your doctor recommends because it's new and experimental and expensive. But we're very happy to pay for the poison pill that
It's a lot
quick
cheaper.
and cheap.
Right.
You can see why an insurance company would want that.
Right.
What about if it's not, the relationship with insurance companies is changing if we keep the Obamacare, the national health care that was just upheld in the Supreme Court. So how does that play into it?
Well, I mean, that's a good question, but anytime you have a single massive bureaucracy in charge of something, it usually becomes less efficient, but also less personal. And so I think a vote against this bill is a vote for individual rights and liberties. To say that this is not a bureaucratic, healthcare decision that can be made on my behalf by friends or the physician, but I have a right to life, and the physicians and the medical community has an obligation to life, and so this confuses that. And so, and again, we're concerned about the decline into elder abuse because people will be viewed as option A, expensive treatment, or option B, you can just get rid of them.
So elder abuse from the financial end of paying the bills.
Right.
I know in a documentary about the Netherlands, people were saying there was pressure from their family. It's so awkward and difficult to be by the bedside of someone who's suffering and sick and dying and taking a long time to die. And why not just get it over with? Do us a favor and drop dead,
right.
basically.
Well, and I mean, that puts, just putting that idea into people's heads. I mean, the law is a moral educator, right? And so people of faith, I think for the most part, I know the Catholic Church is working hard against this, recognize that life is valuable inherently. But there are plenty of folks in our society that if something's legal, then it must be okay. And so then it puts that idea in people's heads and sort of says it's okay. So, yeah, you worry about people who are suffering the end of life and probably themselves feel as if they're a burden. I know my godmother kept saying, I want to make sure all my stuff is in order, legally in the house, so when I go, I'm not a burden to anyone. She didn't want to be a burden to anyone, and that's sort of classic of her generation, the World War II Korean generation, very, very selfless. But had this law been in place, I could see her going and just signing up for it because she was old and lived by herself and didn't want to be a burden to any of her extended relatives. So this sends the wrong message. And it's not just the elderly. I know the lawsuit that was filed in court, although it was ultimately unsuccessful, was filed by a group called Second Thoughts, and they are part of a disability community that advocates for folks with physical disabilities. And they're concerned that this will be a threat to them as well, as I understand it, because it really focuses on the idea that there's a quality of life, and that if someone's quality of life doesn't reach a certain threshold, if they're too physically incapacitated or suffering too much pain, then the correct option is to end the life.
So the idea that someone is disposable, that their life does not have enough level of fulfillment, that we wouldn't want to live that way,
Right.
therefore they shouldn't want to live that way.
Right.
I know there's a group called Not Dead Yet.
Right. I think that's the national version of Second Thoughts.
So that's their point is, we're not dead yet. Don't write us off.
Right.
Don't say our life is not valuable. Maybe we do find value in our life.
Right.
Now but this would be more of a persuasive thing where once it gets into the culture,
Right.
how does somebody feel? They're sick. They're facing death not too far away.
Right.
How does that make them feel?
I think it makes them feel as if they're disposable, and it feels like a threat, because once this choice can be made by the individual, once the choice itself becomes acceptable, and like you said, spreads into the culture, then I think it's only a matter of time before the choice can be made by others on behalf of that individual, particularly if the person is, perhaps mentally incapacitated.
Yes, that's another thing, is people who are more vulnerable mentally and could be persuaded perhaps.
Right.
Well, as the time goes by with the national health care, it may become your patriotic duty to drop dead so you don't charge too much to the whole national health care system.
I think that was a line of thinking that Adolf Hitler used many years ago.
It does have a very familiar ring, some of these ideas. Well, why don't we're coming to the end of the show in a couple minutes, and maybe you could tell us how can people help if they want to learn more or if they want to get involved.
Sure. Well, you definitely want to educate yourself about this so you can educate your neighbors in your community and your churches. If you go to the Massachusetts Family Institute website, which is www.mafamily.org, one of the sliders right at the top is about stopping the doctor's assisted suicide. And there's some speaking points there and some background information. So definitely get yourself informed, and then tell your neighbors and friends. I know when I first talked to some friends and relatives of mine, they thought it was a good idea until I explained to them what the bill actually said.
Good advice. So just to go over the highlights again for a minute, there's a 30% error rate by doctors.
Right.
So
when it comes to terminal illness. So just because someone is said to be terminal, it doesn't mean they won't live for decades more with proper treatment. There's also no safeguards for giving a mental health assessment before someone would take this pill. There's no safeguards for who would administer it or how or when. And you have only one person of the two witnesses needs to be not in the will. So there's potential for elder abuse there.
Okay, so we have a misleading bill called Death with Dignity coming up in November at the polls in Massachusetts. And be sure you read the fine print ahead of time. You may really want to know what's in this bill before you vote. I think that will bring us close to the end. We have some hope for you to help by going to mafamily.org, mafamily.org, and you could inform yourself and decide before you vote. So, Andrew, thank you very much for being on our show.
Thank you for having me. It's a
and
pleasure.
we'll keep stay informed. Thank you. We hope that a lot of people have gotten informed before they vote in November.
Very good.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you.